project governance, now we've already seen a bit about project governance earlier in the course. What I mean by project governance is it's how projects make decisions. Projects often have to make a decision. What language are they going to be written in? How are they going to do their documentation? How are they going to do their distribution? What policy are they going to have for copyright? Who are they going to allow to do commits? What coding style are they going to use? Some of these are technical decisions, some of these are administrative decisions, some of these are political decisions. But there needs to be some mechanism for a project to be able to make those decisions. And so what this lecture is looking at is what project structures allow those decisions to be made. So the key governance features are these. Different governance methods are distinguished in the following ways. Is it a formal or an informal governance model? Most FOSS projects have a fairly informal governance model. It usually isn't even written down anywhere. It's just a set of norms that have developed around the project, and people follow along with what has been done before by observing on the mailing list, by being part of the project over a number of years, and the attitude is that's just how we do things around here, right? Whereas some projects have a formal attitude towards project governance, formal mechanisms for governance, and in that case they might have a written constitution. They might incorporate as a club or a company or a non-profit organisation, and they might have written down bylaws, they might have rules up on their website. Some of them might have some of those rules being private to the project members. Most projects make their governance rules public so that everyone can see what the rules are. So you should have a look at your project to see whether your particular project uses formal or informal rules. If they're formal rules, you should read them. If they're informal rules, you need to work out what they are by observing the project, reading the history of the project, seeing how it works. The degree of project funding can make a big difference to governance. Projects that have a lot of funding tend to have a lot more governance associated with them, partly because they might need to start paying tax. They might need to start worrying about the rules of non-profits. When you register yourself, if you have a large amount of money involved, there is the risk of fraud, there is the risk of violating some tax law in the various jurisdictions or countries you might be in. And those tax laws might require you to have certain paperwork to make decisions in a formal manner. And often it's based on a threshold. If your income is above a certain level, then you might need to have more formal decision making than if it's at a lower level. So we had this in the Samba project at one stage. We wanted to open a bank account to allow people to make donations. And at the time, the total amount of money involved each year in the Samba project was about $10,000, $15,000, not very much. And we spoke to the bank and to open a business bank account for the project team, and the bank told us that yes, we could, but only if we had some sort of formality involved. And they said the minimum formality was for us to be, in Australia, an unincorporated club. So we made ourselves into unincorporated club, and the way we did that, after speaking to the people at the bank, was we just had to have an email on our mailing list to all of the team members say, hi, we want to open a bank account, does everyone agree? And everyone on the team wrote back and said, yes, I agree. We printed those mails out and took them to the bank, and they said, yep, that's fine, you're now an unincorporated club in our eyes, you can open a bank account. So really it was very, very simple. It was a minimal level of legal involvement and formality. Since then, we've become more formal, and we've got slightly higher levels of funding, and we're now incorporated as part of the Software Freedom Law Centre as what's called a 5013C non-profit in the United States. Anyway, so that's a slightly more formal. Some free software projects have tens of millions of dollars of funding. The Mozilla project is one of the best known. The Mozilla project receives something like $70 million a year in funding from Google for advertising. And they have a much more formal structure, board of directors, financial officers, full-time employees, that sort of thing. Okay. Is there an identifiable project team? Some projects have a distinct project team. Usually that's defined as the people who have the right to make changes to the project. Now some projects don't have an identifiable project team. It's anyone who makes a commit, anyone who sends a mail to a particular location, that mail gets accepted. It might be that you submit 2 mails and then after that you get commit access. There's all sorts of different rules that different projects might have. If the project has an identifiable project team, particularly identified on their website, that's part of their project governance, and usually the decisions for the project are then made by that project team. Does the project have a legal structure? So has it incorporated as a legal entity in some country or multiple countries? Some projects do and some projects don't. If they do, then usually that comes with a bunch of formality and rules associated with that legal structure. For example, a constitution. Does the project have a BDFL? A BDFL is a term that's often used in the free software community. It stands for Benevolent Dictator for Life. Can anyone guess what that might mean?
One person's taken responsibility for the whole thing, but they're not like ruling with an iron fist. They're open to suggestions.
That's right, they're benevolent. It's usually the person who starts the project. The project founder, if that project founder is heavily involved in the project for a long time and tends to be the one that drives the project forward, then often other people will start referring to them as the BDFL. And it's a term of endearment. It's a joke term in many ways to say that they're the benevolent dictator. Basically, they get the right to make the decisions, but usually they make the decisions in the best interests of the project. They're benevolent, they're nice dictators. And you do need to understand that many or even most FOSS projects are not democracies. Decisions are either made as a meritocracy, sometimes as a dictatorship, and being a dictatorship can work extremely well, as long as the dictator is benevolent. What happens if the dictator becomes not benevolent, if they start doing things that are against the interests of the project, according to the other developers? A fork can happen, right? It's rare, but it does happen, and it has happened with some quite well-known projects. But there's only a few cases each year that tend to happen. So next thing in project governance is the project a hobby project? So some projects are hobbies. They're done because the person enjoys it. They do it often just on their own time, on weekends or evenings, because they enjoy it. In fact, most free software projects would be classified as hobby projects. Most of the ones that are included on your distribution would be hobby projects, people doing it on their own time for fun because they enjoy it. If it's not a hobby project, it might be that they are deriving some of their income from it. It might be that they are paid to work on it by a company, or they derive some income in some way. And one of the later lectures today will be looking particularly at the different ways that people can derive income from FOSS projects. Is there an agreed voting system? Some projects have a either formalised or informal voting system, a way of making decisions and counting who votes. Now, this is like a democracy, but it's not quite, because voting systems, commonly they aren't a matter of saying who has the most votes. It's often a case of one negative vote kills the proposal. And I'll talk more about that voting system a bit later in this lecture. So, does the project have a copyright policy? If the project, we talked about copyright policies yesterday in the lecture on FOSS and the law, and some projects have a formalised copyright policy requiring assignment or requiring some particular way of people contributing and what type of copyright is required before you can contribute. That is part of the project governance. That's part of the structure of the project, and it's an important feature of how the project works. Okay, project roles. This is another major part of the project governance. Lots of FOSS projects have designated roles. And so individual developers or small groups of developers will have a hat, it's often called. They wear the hat as being the person who is the release manager or the project leader. And some individuals might have multiple hats. They might have their hat as working for some company, their hat as the release manager, their hat as the project leader, and sometimes they have to change hats. And that sort of terminology is often used, and the hat type analogy is used because people they sometimes react differently when they're wearing the different hats. They'll say something on a mailing list like, wearing my release manager hat, I think we should do the following. In other words, because of considerations related to release management, I think we should make the following decision. And you see this sort of wearing of hats type discussions, mentioned in FOSS discussions. So these are the common roles. There's all sorts of different roles are possible, but these ones are particularly common in FOSS projects. FOSS projects often have one or more project leaders. There's some that have more than one, some that have a single identifiable project leader. Very often projects have a release manager, somebody who's in charge of putting out the releases, ensuring that the releases pass all the necessary testing, that they have the right documentation, that they have the right internationalization already done, that all of the open bugs, the critical bugs, are closed before the release happens, and not just deleted, actually closed and fixed. That's a common thing in proprietary companies, actually, that they just delete the bugs when, in order to, anyway, there's a bit of history behind that. So the release manager, his job is to get the release out, actually do the releases, announce the releases, that sort of thing. The bug master, there's often somebody who's in charge of the bug tracking system, making sure that every bug that comes in is assigned to a developer, making sure that if a bug hasn't been looked after for a while, that they bug the developer, that they go and ask the developer who's supposed to be working on that, are they able to work on it? If they're not, find somebody else to work on it. Doing bug triage, looking at how serious the bug is, assigning it a severity level, and then working out if it's a really severe bug, making it a high priority and pushing for a developer to fix it. If it's a less severe bug, assigning it a lower priority, and you may let it sit there for a while if everyone's very busy. A documentation master, there's often somebody who's in charge of the documentation for the project, ensures it's in good shape, makes decisions regarding the format that's going to be used for the documentation, reads the documentation to make sure it's up to date with the latest changes in the program, may do a book deal. The documentation person may in fact approach a publisher and see if the documentation can be published as a book, or may want to write their own book on the project. That's quite common for projects to create paper or electronic books for the documentation of a particular project. The webmaster is in charge of the website, to make sure that the website is appealing to users and developers and contains all the necessary information, make sure it doesn't have any security holes, that sort of thing. The security officer is in charge of ensuring that the project tries to make sure good practices are used to reduce security holes happening in the software in the first place, and when a security hole is found, make sure that the project follows all the right procedures to make sure that the security hole is fixed in a timely fashion. And that is an absolutely critical role, the security officer, and there are some quite formalised procedures in the free software world for dealing with security holes. And I'm happy to talk about those a bit later if you're interested. The PR officer, somebody who does the advertising for the project, speaks to the press. Projects that have a higher profile, you'll often find that journalists will write to you and ask about the project. Or sometimes master's students write to you and ask about the project and ask about the history of the project, that sort of thing, and maybe the PR officer will deal with that. You may want to create stickers or t-shirts. You'll notice I've got a Samba team sticker here, created by somebody in the Samba team as like a PR or swag for the project, as it's often called. And there are t-shirts and there's sweatshirts and there's hats and all sorts of things that are done. But the main role of the PR officer is to deal with public issues, particularly related to the press. And you have to know how to deal with journalists, which can be quite tricky. Trying to make sure that the journalist writes something accurate in their article if they're going to write anything about the project at all. Most projects, of course, a journalist never approaches them. But if you're the sort of project that is a bit higher profile, then it will probably happen at some stage, and knowing how to deal with journalists is worthwhile. The mailing list manager, somebody who deals with mailing list requests, makes sure that Bouncers are fixed quickly, make sure that any of the administrative requests for joining the list or leaving the list are dealt with, make sure that the archives are working and searchable, that sort of thing. The legal officer is the person who deals with all of those legal issues we discussed in yesterday's lecture on FOSS and the law. And so it's their job often to deal with patent issues, copyright, GPL enforcement if it's a GPL project, and all of the other types of legal issues, trademarks, etc. that might come up. So often these roles are not unique. One person may take on several roles. You can see there's quite a few roles, and projects often have less developers than that. So it might be that one person does everything. It might be that you might also rotate the roles. So some projects have a formal rotation system where, say, once a month or once every 6 months, you rotate the roles to a different person. And some projects vote on some of these particular members each year. So every year there's an election among the developers, and they work out who is going to be the next year's project leader, who's going to be the release manager, etc. The larger projects tend to have that type of system. Smaller projects, it tends to be less formal. Project funding. Funding varies a lot between projects. Some projects have strong corporate sponsorship. For example, OpenSolaris.org has very strong corporate sponsorship from Sun, because they are the originators of that project. And although it is an open source project, it has a lot of input and control by Sun Microsystems, because it's a very big part of their corporate strategy. And so there's a lot of funding for the OpenSolaris effort that comes from Sun Microsystems. Some projects rely on donations. The FreeBSD project, for example, relies on donations, and they get quite considerable donations. Some free software projects might get hundreds of thousands of dollars of donations a year, which can buy, quite a lot of web hosting, or it can buy a lot of hardware or whatever is needed for the project. Although most projects don't use donations to pay developers. It's quite unusual for a project to use donations to actually pay salaries. The reason for that is you need a lot of donations to pay a salary, and so it doesn't tend to be very good value for money. So there are some that do use donations to pay for salaries, but it's unusual. You'd need a very big donation pool to be able to pay for salaries.
Who makes the decision on how to spend the money?
That's usually, there's a more formal, if you're receiving larger amounts of donations, there's usually a more formal project team, or there might be some formal organisation. So in the case of the Samba team, we have a Samba team. We have a list of people who have commit access, and within that team we have some people who look after the bank account, and those people decide how the money is spent. But we have rules on how the money is spent. We have a constitution, and those rules state that they must be spent in a way that benefits the aims of the project, the free software project. And in fact, if we violated those rules, we could be in trouble with the United States Tax Office, because we could lose our non-profit status if we spent the money, if we went on holidays with the money or something like that. Many projects also provide public accounting. So they provide a web page where they say exactly what they spent their money on each year, so that people know what their money is, their donations are going towards. That's extremely common in free software projects if they do have a significant amount of donations. But most free software projects that accept donations get very small donations, might get a few $100s a year, in which case those few $100s might pay, for example, some web hosting, or to buy a new machine, or to buy some books, that sort of thing. Most projects don't get larger enough amounts of funding that it's really an issue.
So they don't have to consult any developer who contributes?
There's usually, when there's donations available, there's usually somebody clear who looks after the project and can make the decisions as to what the money is going towards. And usually you wouldn't make a donation to a project unless you trusted the people who are running the project to do something good with the money you're donating. And most donations to free software projects are very small. People might donate $20, $50, that sort of thing, which means they're not too worried about exactly what happens to it. It's when you get larger donations, and there have been cases of donations of hundreds of thousands of dollars, individual donations. When that happens, there's often a higher degree of accountability on exactly what happens to the money, and you might have an accountant who provides signed books each year that proves exactly what the money was used for. but that's rare. It's relatively rare in the free software community. Okay. Most SourceForge projects are purely volunteer efforts and don't involve any project funding, except in the sense that SourceForge itself is funded by a company as a service to the community. And there are a lot of companies that provide a service to the community. There's a good example here in Canberra. The CASE project, which is there's a project here in Canberra that provides community assistance and support and education. That's what CASE stands for. And it helps out non-profit organisations in Canberra to use FOSS projects to enhance the, to make charities more effective, to make non-profit organisations in Canberra more effective. And in fact, CASE is the one that is strictly giving the lectures here. I'm a volunteer for CASE, and so my work in this project is as a volunteer, and the lecture fees, etc. go to CASE. But CASE is a good example of an organisation that is a volunteer effort, but it is providing infrastructure for other FOSS projects to be able to thrive, including this course. So it's they give more than they cost. Various estimates. There's been some people who've estimated how much it would cost to build something like a Linux distribution like what you're using, the Ubuntu Linux distribution, if you wanted to pay software engineers normal software engineering salaries in order to be able to get them to produce something like Ubuntu. You can estimate how much it would cost based on the number of lines of code and estimates on how much it costs per line of code, and those estimates tend to come out to several $1 billion. Now, but nobody has actually paid several $1 billion to develop this software, so most of that effort has happened through volunteers. So most of the funding of free software projects happens through volunteer efforts, like yourselves. Project funding is only a tiny fraction of the several $1 billion value of something like a Linux distribution. So legal structure. Some projects have a strong legal structure, and it tends to be for larger, older projects. Many of them are non-profits or charities. The most common, as I've mentioned, is a US 501c3, which is a particular legal structure in the United States, which is a non-profit organisation that exists under some very particular rules as to what the non-profit is allowed to do. And it's probably the most common legal structure when a free software project has a legal structure. There are some other variants that are also quite widely used. Project groups. A lot of projects form into a group of related projects. And those related projects, the larger project group might have a legal structure which then flows into the legal structure of the individual projects. And some of the better known ones are things like the Apache project, which has a whole bunch of sub-projects and has a formalised legal structure around the overall project grouping. The GNU projects, which have a legal structure around each individual one. The KDE projects and GNOME projects, which are the desktop projects for creating the KDE and GNOME desktops. You're using the GNOME desktop in the lab here at the moment. And the Software Freedom Conservancy, which isn't associated with any individual project, that was created by the Software Freedom Law Centre, which is that law firm that I mentioned yesterday, started by Evan Moglin. And it is a group, it's a legal structure which offers free legal hosting of other projects. So if you want a legal structure, you want free legal advice, you can become a member of the Software Freedom Conservancy if you're a free software project. So I mentioned voting systems. Many projects have adopted a voting system, and but I should say that most decisions that get made on a day-to-day basis in most projects are not voted on, they just happen. And somebody who's responsible for a particular area of the code just makes the change. And what happens is, if in the rare case that somebody objects to that change, then after they've made the change, there is then a discussion as to whether it could be done better or improved. But usually there isn't a vote before each and every decision. It just happens, right? It's very informal. But some projects have a more formalised voting system and actually have votes quite frequently. It's particularly often used for election of project roles. It's also used for some patches. Some projects have a system where a patch cannot be accepted unless a number of people vote to say that yes, that's a good patch. The most commonly used voting system are variants upon the Apache voting system. And the way it works is somebody makes a proposal. I think we should make the following change. I think we should move our hosting somewhere else. Then it's sent out to the mailing list. Then the other developers on the mailing list might write back and say just +1, and that's everything in the mail. +1, they send the mail. That just means I agree. So it's a reply to the mail saying +1. So if you see a +1, it's not just a typo, it's somebody agreeing with the previous mail, right? They might say =0, meaning abstain. They're saying, I don't have an opinion, in which case they might as well not send the mail, really. Or they could say -1, saying, I disagree. And -1, in some projects, -1 is considered a veto. So if anyone says -1, the proposal doesn't go ahead. And what happens is, when you do a -1, you are required to explain why. So -1s usually come with an explanation saying, -1, this would cause a major problem, it would mean that blah blah blah, you explain why you're disagreeing, and that then triggers a discussion between all the developers, and then it only goes ahead once that issue is resolved, and that person eventually comes back and says, yes, that's okay, +1, or a different proposal is put up and everyone agrees to it. Right? So it's not quite a democracy, it's not just majority rule, it's more like a meritocracy, but you sort of find out if everyone thinks it's a good idea, and you have to really get almost unanimous decision, or you can get some people abstaining who just don't say anything at all. And you need to make sure that when you do have a vote going on like this, you give sufficient time for people in different time zones to respond. You don't want a decision, if people are spread out all over the world, all happening in half an hour, because otherwise some people will be asleep and they won't be able to answer. You might even leave it several days in some cases. For important decisions, you might leave it several weeks to make sure that everyone who's away on holiday gets a chance to come back and vote on the really important decision. Okay? So a veto cannot be ignored and must come with an explanation. That's a common rule. And sometimes these rules aren't written down. It's just agreed upon through past practice. Okay, copyright policies. Why does copyright matter? I talked yesterday about the various policies people can have, but basically what copyright does is it gives the right to sue, and it also gives the right to relicense. So if you hold the copyright, then anyone holding copyright in a project has the right to sue somebody who's abusing the copyright license, who is infringing upon the license for the project. So the copyright can be important if you want to enforce your license. Plus, it also gives the right to relicense. Only the copyright holders can change the license. And so that's why many projects require assignment in order to have the possibility of changing license in the future. Various common policies. Some projects have copyright assignment, like I mentioned yesterday. Some use developer sign-off, the sign-off by that you used in the lab. Some have personal copyright, and most projects just have anything goes. Most projects don't have a formal copyright policy, they just say, you submit the patch, we accept it, that's fine. Because most projects don't ever have to worry about legal problems, and so the minimum friction, the minimum problem is just to accept it, right? And then they deal with the issues that come up later. And most projects get away with that. If you're a larger project, you might like to think about having a slightly more formal policy. Reaction to legal challenge. Copyright policies are often seen as creating friction. They're also often only adopted after some defining event. So it's often that something happens in the project history that causes a problem with copyright, and that then causes a policy change to happen for future contributions to try to prevent the problem from happening again. Okay, committers. Some project members will have direct commit access, which means that they will be able to make changes to the source code without having asked permission for anyone else. They don't have to get anyone else to say, yes, that's good, and apply the change for them. Adding committers, the usual rule in a FOSS project is that you get an invitation from the existing committers, or in some projects, an invitation from the project leader. So that's sometimes one of the roles of the project leader, is to invite new committers. And they usually get invited when they have made a significant contribution over a sustained period of time, and then you say, would you like to become a direct committer, rather than having to go via patches on the mailing list, and you invite them to become a committer for the project. The main property that a good committer has to have before you invite them, a good person has to have before you invite them to become a committer on the project, is good judgment. You need to be able to work out whether the person doing the commit has the necessary technical knowledge and necessary skills to know the difference between a good change and a bad change. And that's quite a difficult software engineering task in some cases. They have to have good judgment to know what is a good patch. Because otherwise, if they don't have that good judgment, they might put in bad patches. Because when you give them commit access, very often that means that they can make changes without anyone else seeing them. They might review them later. And so you want to make sure that you only give people with good judgment direct commit access. Some projects have a much lower barrier to entry than that.
Would you say that that's also, apart from the technical merits of the particular changes being made, that judgment encompasses a big picture understanding
Yes,
of the project and
that's
really
right.
understanding?
That's right.
I think one risk is that somebody with commit access can start to take bits of the project off on
Yes.
their particular slant, not see
That's
the
right.
picture.
That's right. Yes. So understanding the overall project and agreeing with the rest of the developers about the overall direction of the project is quite important for a committer. Okay. Should inactive committers be removed? If a committer hasn't committed anything for 2 or 3 years, should you remove them from the commit list, or a year or 6 months? There's a bit of a debate about that in the free software community. In Carl Vogel's book, I mentioned that Carl Vogel's book on producing open source software, he suggests you shouldn't remove them. And he says that because if they had good judgment then, why do you think they've got bad judgment now? Right? Their judgment probably hasn't changed, so they might start contributing it again later. Now, we have a different attitude in the Samba team. We do remove people if they haven't made any contribution at all for a year. The reason we do it is because of security. Because to get commit access to Samba.org, you have to have an SSH account on Samba.org, so you have to have login, and we are concerned that inactive accounts might lead to people breaking into Samba.org and defacing the site or modifying the commit tree. A discarded SSH key, a lost SSH key, can cause a great deal of trouble. So we tend to prune people if they haven't been active for a year because we don't want too many accounts out there, too many people with SSH access to the server who could do damage when they lose their laptop or whatever. We want to make sure that they're active developers. Okay, committers with distributed source code management. The committer role is different when you have a distributed source code management system, particularly if you're using it in a pure distributed role. It might be that the only person who is a real committer is the one that creates some sort of master release tree, and everyone else is, in a sense, a committer to their own branch, their own repository, and everyone pulls from each other. So distributed SCMs tend to have a different workflow, and they have a different definition of what a committer really is. But many distributed source code management tools can also be used in a centralized fashion. And so in fact you may have the concept of committers even with a distributed source code management tool. Project leaders, there are varying approaches to project leadership. Some projects have a default project leader who is just the project founder. Some projects use a steering committee or board where they have a formal steering committee. Some projects vote on their leader every year. Some projects have no easily identifiable leader. Some projects it's actually hard to work out who the leader is, right? Because everyone is just sort of cooperating and doing things, and no one in particular is the one who makes the decisions. And that's surprisingly common in the free software community, and it can actually work. Sometimes a project leader emerges just as the one who tends to be pushing the project forward and doing the most work. So what the leader does is helps to decide on project goals, helps to resolve disputes. If there are disputes between developers, the project leader has to be the voice of reason, has to be calm, has to be the one that tries to make people see each other's point of view and tries to resolve the dispute. The project leader may set the standards for code or testing or other development tasks, may, for example, decide on coding style. The project leader may decide on what are the main goals for the next year, a roadmap for the project perhaps. And often the project leader is often the PR person for the project, often acts as the project spokesperson. When they make announcements or they talk to the media, very often it's the project leader who does that. So the release manager is the one who puts the release together, and it can be a lot of work. It needs a lot of coordination between the developers. It's often an extremely stressful role. Being the release manager for a large project can involve a lot of late nights, a lot of hard work around the release time. So before you take on the release manager role for a project, be aware that it can be extremely stressful and a lot of work. You might not be writing much code, but there's a lot of other work to be done to put out a large release. Some projects base, so what goes into a release? The project has to decide when the releases are going to happen and what new work is going to go into a particular release. Now, some projects base this purely on time. They'll do it every 6 months regardless. And some base it on some particular criterion for whether a release happens, that all bugs are gone or a particular goal in development has been met. There's also a very common system in the free software world of having stable and unstable series of releases. So you might have a series of stable releases, which are releases that you want everyone to upgrade to and use, and unstable releases which are aimed at developers. And there's an odd-even system that's often used where the release numbering, the odd release numbers are the unstable ones, and the even release numbers are the stable ones. That's become quite common in the free software world, originally used by the Linux kernel, though less used by the Linux kernel now, but it's been adopted by many other projects that have this stable, unstable, odd, even release numbering system. Okay, projects tend to evolve over time. They often start with a very simple and very small amount of governance. And that simple governance often makes for fast early development because governance can provide friction. Too many rules slows things down sometimes. So then complexity tends to get added as it's needed. So as issues and disputes arise, new governance systems are added, and often the solutions for governance are adopted from other free software projects. And so they look at how another free software project that they admire solves a particular issue and then adopt that technique. Alright, so that's it for project governance. We're now a little bit late for morning tea, and so we'll pop off and have some morning tea, and then we've got the first lab. And hopefully you'll all have worked to be starting to do some work on your chosen project in this lab. Thanks very much.